Since World War II, Californians have relied on ever-expanding roadways to drive farther and farther distances to get from here to there. The result has been sprawl and more vehicle miles traveled. Recently, concerns over air pollution and climate change have urban planners looking at a wider variety of transportation and housing options. But will they work? We'll talk to Laura Podolsky and Jean-Claudia Scara with the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis and Paul Zajkowski, the Associate Director of the Local Government Commission. Livable Communities, coming to a neighborhood near you?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
California has adopted innovative goals and strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What are the state's goals and what are those strategies to achieve those goals? We're fortunate to be joined by two experts, Laura Podolsky and Jean-Claudia Scara from the National Center of Sustainable Transportation and the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. Welcome.
Thank you.
Jean-Claudia, let me start with you first. California's got some very significant climate change legislation, two big pieces, AB 32 and SB 375. What are the goals of that legislation?
Sure. AB 32 is kind of the umbrella, big picture setting legislation that commits the state to reducing greenhouse gas emissions back to 1990 levels by 2020. It's been reinforced lately by an executive order that says we should get to 40% below those 1990 levels by 2030. That's the big picture. There are many ways the state's doing that. SB 375 is one of them that focuses on reducing transportation-related emissions through transportation investments and land use.
Okay, so that's obviously a big impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And we're talking about some of the new legislation going on now, Laura. Senator Pro Tem Kevin De Leon is proposing the Senate Bill 350. If signed into law, what would that legislation do?
It really builds off of the existing framework and infrastructure we already have. So talking about AB 32, it set the targets for 2020. So this will really set those targets for 2030 and just make sure that all those regulations and policy programs that are in place that state agencies are already working on, that they're recognizing those 2030 targets and working towards those.
Yeah, and some of the goals are pretty specific. They want to reduce petroleum use in cars and trucks by 50% by 2030. They want California utilities to have at least 50% of electricity from renewable sources. They want building standards to be improved in terms of efficiency, 50% increase, not just new, but existing buildings. So those are some pretty big things that law is doing. Jean-Claudia, let me ask you this. The key goal of all this legislation is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But it seems like the key strategy is to change land use policies to do that. Why?
Okay, offer a slight correction there.
Okay.
So land use is a key strategy, but it's not the key strategy. The state is really working with a number of different strategies to reduce greenhouse gases. Those are strategies that look at industry and manufacturing, fuel production, the fuel industry, automobile use and travel patterns, etc.
So rather than the.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
And land use figures in. Each of those strategies has a different time horizon. Land use strategies are really looking far out. How is our state growing and developing? And that's where that plays in. Is it growing in a way that's going to support those greenhouse gas reductions and reduced automobile reliance in the long term?
You know, one of those land use strategies talks about land use mix. What is that, and how does it impact greenhouse gas emissions?
You can think of land use mix as the fabric of your community. What does it look like? Land uses are typically thought of as residential in categories: residential, industrial, commercial, religious. When we plan our communities and build them, do we isolate uses? Do we have all the residential in one place and all the commercial here, or do we mix it up a little bit? What's the fabric? And the research shows that higher levels of mixing among these different uses makes it easier for people to walk to destinations, bike to destinations, have shorter distances between destinations, et cetera.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, my mom happens to live in San Diego, and nice place, but literally retail is 3 miles away. And so you can't walk there. I mean, you have to drive there. And so that was kind of the old model. The new model sounds like you'd mix retail and residential together.
Yes,
Okay.
precisely.
So in addition to changing land use policies, another thing you hear a lot planners talk about is improving connectivity. What are they talking about?
You can think of connectivity about your local street network. So typically intersections within the street network are ways that enable you to get from point A to B. The more intersections there are, a very intersection-rich street grid allows you to get from A to B faster. If you're looking at the street grid of a post-war suburban development, not so much of that. A lot of loops, a lot of cul-de-sacs that go nowhere, that really sort of make you take the long way around and don't make it easy to connect from A to B.
Laura, one of the things that you hear from the critics of this is that you're really trying to squash or attack the American dream, the home in the suburbs, and then environmentalists just want to push everyone into high-density urban living. Is that going to be the new normal, high-density urban living?
Well, I think all those discussions around land use really have to be in the context of a certain community or city, county, or region. And so, for example, in a city where they have an average density of 4 houses on an acre, if you just increase that by 50%, put 6 houses on an acre, that is a significant increase in density, but that's getting you nowhere close to anything like San Francisco, New York. So you can make like incredible leaps and bounds in density relative to where you're at as a community. Another thing I'd like to push back on is that I also think that the American dream is to really live a safe, healthy, and prosperous life. That's the American dream. And in using a suburban style lifestyle as the icon of that, I just think that it's not representing this bigger vision and dream that people want to achieve.
You have a different dream. Okay,
Yeah.
We've got only about 15 seconds left in this segment, so
Sure.
very quickly. Impact of transit access in terms of transit use. Being close to transit to help?
Oh, absolutely. So when we think about using transit as an option, what do we think about? Can it get me where I'm going? Is it close? Can I get to it by walking or biking? When I get there at the end of my transit trip, can I bike or walk or somehow get to my final destination quickly? Those kinds of things.
So being close is very important. Well, thanks for that discussion on land use and transportation strategies implemented to meet these greenhouse gas emission goals. Up next, sustainable transportation. What is that and how will it work in car-crazy California? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Making strategic decisions on land use and transportation infrastructure appear to be key if you're going to deal with growing places like the San Joaquin Valley and helping them meet the state's greenhouse gas emission goals. So implementing those decisions obviously aren't going to be easy. We're talking with Laura Podolsky and Jean-Claudia Scara from the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. So Laura, let me start with you first. Most obvious question. You've got 6 decades of planning around the automobile and single-family homes. In places like the San Joaquin Valley, it's very, very common. How do you move to a mass transit situation or getting people to walk and bike to their jobs in that kind of situation?
This is a good question. It's no easy feat. And I think you have to think about it as baby steps and little things that you can do that don't require, that are the low-hanging fruit that you can do that will slowly move your community towards that goal. And so, for example, repurposing streets is a great example of how you can take streets that are usually just for cars and look for ways that you can add bike lanes and make that street safer for other modes.
The complete streets concept you hear about.
Complete streets. And really the one easy low-hanging fruit is when a city or county goes to restripe a roadway, that's the perfect time to think about, should we restripe it differently?
Yeah, Jean-Claudia, one of the critiques of all this work of limiting growth and encouraging densities is that some folks, those folks who want a suburban lifestyle, would say, okay, fine, I'm just going to move farther out. So actually, this strategy might encourage sprawl. What would you say to that?
I would say that there is some evidence of spillover effects. So communities that have chosen to limit growth in their jurisdiction have seen some of it move elsewhere. Overall, however, SB 375 really provides a very strong element of regional coordination so that cities within a region have to work together to meet this regional land use goal that's going to bring us to the greenhouse gas reduction.
So it kind of deals with that. Another issue with regionalization is this fiscalization of land use. This idea that every community wants to get those sales tax dollars, so they're going to put a retail establishment in their community, whether it's a good idea or not. How does that impact, this idea of trying to stop these vehicle miles traveled and getting people out of their cars?
Well, absolutely. Absent a very robust property tax, cities are driven to look at sales taxes and other means of bringing revenue to their communities. So that's real. And there's evidence that shows that city elected officials make decisions based on that. However, SB 375 does bring cities within a region together, hopefully to minimize this intercity ratables chase and have
Do
them
they talk about
coordinate more.
that in those meetings? Are they going to talk about, where the tax dollars are going to go, make some kind of regional tax sharing agreement?
That remains to be seen. That would certainly be a very positive step and something that would reinforce SB 375. I would say that if you look across the United States, that has not been a very popular trend. Jurisdictions tend to be very possessive about their tax revenues, and there's also some theory that suggests that if people want a community that has the revenues to provide those amenities, they'll move there. We don't need to redistribute across larger segments.
Right, it's going to be a constant battle, no doubt. Well, a lot of this discussion is about independence versus dependence. A lot of people, Laura, think that, hey, it's great that we can drive everywhere. Other people say, well, wait a second, if you have to drive everywhere, that's not independence, that's dependence. So, is one of the advantages maybe of providing these alternative modes of transportation to really not just deal with greenhouse gas emissions, but to actually give people more independence?
Exactly, absolutely. And I think a key message here is to talk about resiliency, and individual resiliency and the resiliency of the community. Things happen. Roadways close. Do you have other options or routes for residents to get around, drop their kid off at daycare, go to work? And so having multiple options for residents to get around a community in the region is really helpful. And it also helps to provide different options because let's face it, transportation costs a lot. Owning a car costs a lot, $9,000 to $10,000 a year. And any opportunity that we can provide low-cost, affordable options in a community, you're going to add to that community resilience and that resilience of the individual.
I mean, also, Jean-Claude, it also is, the elderly and the young are particularly affected by this. I mean, the elderly sometimes have a hard time driving. They need an easier way to get around, correct?
Sure, absolutely. Again, this is not about getting everybody to ditch their car and ride a bike. It's about providing a range of options that you can choose from and make those options more readily available for the kinds of trips you have to make. So you can choose, okay, this trip to the grocery store, I don't have to drive. I just need one or two items. I can do it by bike.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that conversation. Well, what about livable communities? Are they coming to a neighborhood near you? That conversation next. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. What are the types of land use and transportation practices that create healthy, some say livable communities? Our guest is Paul Zygovsky, who is the Associate Director of the Local Government Commission. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks.
So what is a livable community?
Livable communities can be hard to define, really, because it can, to some extent, be in the eye of the beholder. But I think in many cases, we've been able to, in working in this field, I think what we've been able to do is identify what are the features that really make a community healthy and safe. Those are the two primary things that people look for. And as we analyze that a little bit further, we start to recognize that a community that's walkable, a neighborhood that's walkable, typically has all of those elements. If you feel comfortable leaving your house and having your children walk out of your house and walk to the store or walk to school, you probably have a fairly livable neighborhood. Now, in order to make a place walkable, that gets more complicated. That's where we have to start thinking about, are there destinations we can walk to? Are the streets safe to cross, and do we feel comfortable there?
A lot of this sounds like it's a kind of a back to the future kind of situation. I mean,
True.
in the past, weren't cities quite compact, and so walking was not that big a deal?
Yeah, no, if you think back, I mean, most cities were established because human beings are social beings, and we depend on one another for exchange of goods, services, friendship. So the earliest hamlets, towns, villages were places where people came together to increase that exchange of goods and services. So older towns, older neighborhoods typically all have a compactness to them that make it easy for people to walk and get around easily and interact with their neighbors.
But that hasn't been the growth pattern for the last 40 or 50 years. And what are the environmental implications of those growth patterns that we've experienced for the last 4 or 5 decades?
It has been a challenge because we've spread out a lot more. The last, since the 1940s and 50s, we have actually consumed a lot more land than our population growth. About 2.5 times more land has been consumed or paved over, really, than the growth in population. And in addition to that, we're driving further. So our vehicle miles traveled is more than 3 times larger than our population growth. Wow. So that means that, first of all, you're paving over more ag land, more open space, more farmland, more forest land. You're having more polluted runoff, so you get more water pollution. As people drive more, you get more air pollution. So the implications for the environment are significant, and there are also implications for the economy, because if you lose ag land, For example, in the Central Valley, that's a big issue.
Yeah, that's a big issue. So let's talk about the health implications. It sounds to be related to the environmental implications. What are the health implications of these growth patterns?
The health implications, there's two that I really emphasize. One is the increase in asthma over the last decades. I mean, while we've been able to reduce a lot of diseases and illnesses, asthma keeps growing. We're seeing the trends go up. The other one
And
is,
children are particularly affected, correct?
Exactly, yes. Yeah, and it also makes it harder for us to encourage children to exercise, which is obviously very good for growing children. The other big issue is the obesity and overweight epidemic. In the last 30 years, we've seen our population go from about 10–15% of the population considered obese to over 25 or 30%. And that's nationally, that's not just California. So that has some serious implications because the overweight obesity leads to diabetes, it leads to cancers, it leads to heart disease. So we see some really significant problems, not just for adults, but also now for children. We're seeing much larger percentage of children facing overweight and obesity problems as well.
And there are financial consequences for these health outcomes, right?
Absolutely, yeah. We're starting to see costs of health care related to overweight and obesity continue to go up.
So that those costs then are shared by everyone because they're under health insurance, and so everybody picks up a part of that cost.
Definitely.
Okay. You know, cities don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel here, do they? I mean, there's actually, I've heard, toolkits that are available to cities that can kind of guide them in how to build a healthy community. What exactly are in those toolkits?
What are in those toolkits really are, first of all, there's toolkits that address sort of general principles of, how to grow more smartly, how to grow more sustainably. So there's toolkits that sort of address the big picture issues, the vision. But then there's toolkits that get down to some of the details, like how do we design streets that work well? How do we get uses, mix of uses, so we have places that are close to where people live and work, so they can walk to them. So we're starting to see, and then we start to see how those toolkits can also be applied at the local government level to change our planning and our zoning requirements so that they can reinforce these approaches.
You know, one thing I noticed in these toolkits is something about promoting high-quality pedestrian environments. What are they talking about there?
Basically, what we're talking about is creating places where people feel comfortable, safe, walking in their community. There's too many places where people just don't feel comfortable, and we get that from surveys as well. People who say, I'd like to walk more, but I just don't have good, comfortable places to walk, or I can't cross the street safely because the speed of the cars is too great, or there's too much traffic. So really what we're trying to do, it's a combination of things. It's not just the sidewalks, it's also the speed of the traffic and also the crossings of the street.
Yeah, and it's also shade. I mean, it's certainly in places like the San Joaquin Valley, if you don't have shade in the afternoon, you're not going to be outside.
I say that all the time, and we've actually done studies and found that you get about a 10-degree differential between a shaded street and unshaded street. So it's a big issue.
Well, thank you for that discussion of land use and transportation strategies used to design healthy communities. Up next, getting down to the nuts and bolts of designing healthy cities and towns. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Paul Zajkowski with the Local Government Commission about what it takes to build a healthier community. One of the key components in these strategies is connectivity. What specific actions would you recommend to improve a community's connectivity?
It really gets back to walkability. If you think about it, a human being walks at the speed of about 3 miles per hour. That's a far cry from the speed you can get in a car or even on a bicycle. So if we want people to walk, we actually have to provide good connections so that people can take the shortest route. Because as human beings, we also want to take the shortest route. We don't like to be forced to go around and take a longer route. And if we have to take a longer route, more people will tend to drive.
It's interesting, where I live, it's actually quicker to bike about 3 miles to downtown than it is to drive, because the bike trail is a straight line, where the drive is in like an L shape with stoplights. It's actually quicker to bike. So that's, I guess, connectivity.
Exactly.
So some of the tools that communities can consider if they want to increase walkability and bikeability, what would they be? What tools would they use?
Well, they're the big planning tools. We have general plans, we have comprehensive plans in smaller communities, we have zoning codes that help us define where different uses go. But one of the new tools that we're seeing more communities use are active transportation plans. That is a bicycle or a pedestrian master plan. And what communities do with those is really look carefully at the infrastructure, they look at education issues, they look at encouragement, they look at enforcement. They really can look more broadly beyond just sort of the built environment. And those can be very helpful. And right now there's actually a program at the state level that funds active transportation programs. So there's support from Caltrans for these
Well, the
efforts.
idea is really, I think, is to use streets more effectively and efficiently,
Exactly.
not just cars, but also
Exactly.
bikes, and also people can walk on sidewalks,
Exactly.
using those assets more effectively. Let's get a little more focused.
Sure.
Let's talk about neighborhoods or districts within a city. What needs to be done to create walkable neighborhoods and vibrant business districts?
I think there are a lot of small things that can be done that are generally low cost, and we actually work with communities to sometimes help plan some of these efforts out. Things as simple as curb extensions. That is, at the intersection where a car can't park, you extend the curb out so you make the crossing for the pedestrian shorter, you improve visibility of the pedestrian and the cars, and you also actually can help the motorists as well, because if there's a signal there, the cycle, the timing for the signal is shorter. So it's a real win-win on any street that has on-street parking. A curb extension, for example, can help.
So this isn't a mutually exclusive thing. This is going to actually help people in cars as well,
Exactly,
just
exactly.
moving people more quickly.
Yeah.
What about transportation corridors? What role do they play? One of the things you hear a lot is that, well, transportation is not going to work in areas like the San Joaquin Valley because you need higher densities.
Right.
Does transit, will it work in areas like that? Will it pencil out?
It is more challenging because in order to support, for example, a rail system, you do need more density around the stations. You typically will need more, like about 30 units to the acre or 40 units to the acre for a light rail system, which is what the transit planners tell us. Whereas, for bus system every half hour or so, you probably could manage with densities of about 7 units to the acre. And mind you, that those, we're not talking about high-rise development. 30 units to the acre can be accomplished with 3 to 4 story townhouses, apartment buildings, garden apartments. Those provide those nodes of density that really can support a more robust transit system. And I think in smaller, medium-sized cities, smaller cities, some level of transit still is achievable through these efforts.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about complete streets. You hear about
Sure.
that term a lot. How would you define a complete street?
Very simply, it's a street that works for everybody, on which you can circulate if you're in a car, on a bicycle, in transit, or walking. So it's really recognizing that streets are the public realm for our communities. And a lot of the public realm in cities is the streets. 30–40% of the land in a city can sometimes be taken up by streets. So we want to make sure that those streets really are accessible to all, that people can use them to get around. And really for many years, the balance has been more on cars, on moving the cars. And we're now trying to rebalance that a bit and say, no, we really have to think about all different users of streets.
One of the things you also see sometimes in some streets, increasingly now in California, are roundabouts.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about roundabouts.
Sure. Roundabouts are actually one of my favorite topics because they help slow traffic down, which is one of the ways we create a neighborhood that's more walkable. They're easy for pedestrians to cross. They're also very efficient at moving the traffic. So they're actually a very good solution. When well designed, a roundabout can move about a third more traffic than a typical stop-controlled intersection. And if you're a driver, they're actually better because you don't have to come to a full stop. It's basically a yield intersection. You approach, you enter if there are no cars. Bicyclists also can go through them easily.
Let me ask a topic that I'm kind of interested in, that is trails. Just really quickly, what role do they play in building a healthy community?
Trails can obviously support the efforts for complete streets a lot. They provide an alternative place for people to travel and to use basically bicycles and walking as transportation. In this region, we have the American River Parkway, for example, 32 miles that provides a lot of opportunities for people to use that to get from the suburbs and even towns like Folsom all the way downtown.
I think you're going to be seeing that in more communities, including communities in the San Joaquin Valley.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank Paul Zagofsky from the Local Government Commission, Laura Podosky from the Institute for Transportation Studies, and also Jean-Claudia Scara from the Institute for Transportation Studies at UC Davis for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free and award-winning e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.